Hey everybody, I'm proud to have on the show today Dr. Future from the hit radio show Future Quake on the Revelations Radio Network, as well as WENO here in Nashville, Tennessee. Dr. Future and I were both speakers at the Last Days Conference this year in Nashville, and the talk that he did there was probably one of the most discussed talks among the audience as well as the presenters, and we all thought it was just fascinating information and really top-notch research, which Dr. Future is famous for, I guess, is probably better. So today we're going to go over that information for you as well that we're not able to attend the conference. Okay, so let's get started. Why don't you maybe introduce a little bit about your talk, or just get right into it and just take it away.
Okay. Well, yeah. Let me jump into this a little bit. This is a topic, and I guess if I could best introduce it, I call it the role of sorcery and drugs in opening the Last Day Spirit Portal. That's how it was presented at the Last Days Conference this past April in Nashville. But it really was initiated based on a chance story we reviewed on Future Quake, probably around the end of 2008, regarding this chemical DMT, which I will talk about here more so in just a minute. But it had some mysterious history to it, not only as a hallucinogenic chemical or psychoactive chemical, but its religious connotations to it. And this really intrigued me. It was an area I had not really looked into. I've not been one that had a history of partaker of drugs, even alcohol. So I really didn't know much about this material other than what's known to the general public. That led to some more research on my behalf and more interest in doing sort of a foundational show back around January 2009. I invited Dr. Lynn Marzulli to sit in as part of our discussion of my research on DMT and similar drugs. And at various times, I've taken an interest in furthering and advancing my research in this area. And I'm getting more and more convinced all the time that this is an area that all people need to be aware of, particularly the Christian community, because we've been very lax in understanding what goes on in this concept of sorcery and the role of drugs and the spiritual implications itself. And that's really the context of my talk. So if you don't mind, I'm going to proceed further. And Chris, please feel free to interject, ask questions whenever you like along the discussion as we go here.
Okay, great.
The whole purpose of this talk, and just to give you a little heads up here, is to educate, first of all, on some history of sorcery and drugs, in spirit contact, in use in spirit contact, both from secular and biblical records. Try to explain the impact of sorcery activities in the modern era as well, too, which is another fascinating topic. And from there, reveal some current developments in the revival of interest in sorcery today. And then proceed to propose some hypotheses on how these activities can actually fulfill Bible prophecy. And conclude with some suggested activities today that I think may fulfill the model, the prophetic model that I will propose, and then close by recommending some action to actually address this threat. So moving into the body of it, I first need to clarify some definitions for people of some terms that they may not be familiar with. The concept of the word or term theurgy, and I'm going to give you a definition here. It's the practice of rituals, sometimes seen as magical in nature, performed with the intention of invoking the action or presence of one or more gods, especially the goal of uniting with the divine, achieving henosis or perfecting oneself. And henosis relates to having a union with what is fundamental in reality, the one, the source, or monad. So it's a key purpose of conjuring these particular spirits to achieve a desired spiritual end state. Now, there's two types of this. One is called invocation, and invocation is best defined as a form of possession. And this is where an individual's normal personality is replaced by another. This would be the kind of thing you would see when channeling occurs, when you see this spirit comes on someone. Another definition is to draw a spirit within one's body, or within one's own body. Even shamans do this. Medicine men, shamans, Wicca practice this activity. The other approach is evocation, and that is calling or summoning a spirit, demon, god, or other supernatural agent is the definition. And even Aleister Crowley, who is well known to anyone who studies the areas of the occult, he has his own definition to distinguish between the two. He says to invoke is to, quote, call in, just as to evoke is to call forth. In invocation, the macrocosm floods the consciousness, so the outer spirit world comes in you. In evocation, the magician, having become the macrocosm, creates the microcosm. So, in his view or understanding, the magician becomes the controlling universe and then is able to summon forth gods. So you will hear invocation and evocation all the time, but invocation, they come in, they sort of take you over, they speak through you, for example. Evocation is when they actually appear or manifest themselves in some form before you. Another term people need to understand is what this word sorcery means. Sorcery, if you look in a simple definition, for example, in Wikipedia, it's called the manipulation of magic. But I'm very interested in what the ancient world says, and particularly the Bible. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew word, it's keshef, I believe is the pronunciation, and it relates to sorcery or witchcraft. In the New Testament, there are actually two words that are used. One is mageo, and that means to be a magician or to practice magical arts. But the one I'm really interested in the most is the term pharmakia. And pharmakia is the use or the administering of drugs involved in sorcery, magical arts, and often in connection with idolatry and fostered by it. So drugs are a key connection, and obviously you see the word pharmakia and its connection to pharmacy and what we know is administering of drugs. And the last term I just want to make sure people are clear on is this term shamanism. And probably a simple definition is shamans are intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds. So these are a very, very ancient form of people that do this particular function itself. Now, just to give you a couple examples that we have in the ancient literature where these events occurred, if you go back and look at the book of First Enoch. Now, First Enoch, if your listeners are not aware of that, is a book that some consider writing that is worthy of consideration as being factual and accurate. It is quoted in the Bible, in the book of Jude, and elsewhere in the Bible, which gives it very special consideration. The book of Enoch has been kept in the canon of the Ethiopian church since its earliest days, one of the earliest segments of the church body. So it's something that's considered in great esteem. Some portions of it, particularly as you get later sections that may have been written at a later date, cause more concern and conjecture. But anyway, First Enoch is held in great esteem, and it talks a good bit about what happened when these angels, 200 angels, came down to cohabitate with women in the days before the flood. And this event is alluded to in Genesis chapter 6, as well as, again, in Jude and a few other places in the New Testament. But a couple of these people, and these are in foreign tongues, so I'm not often able to completely pronounce them correct, but Semjaza and Amoros were two of these leaders. In fact, Semjaza is considered possibly the ringleader of these angels who, as the Bible says, left their first estate and came down to cohabitate with women. It says that later they were judged for this at the time of the flood and were actually imprisoned in a special place called Tartarus. But one of the things that the book of Enoch says that they did was they taught mankind enchantments and root cuttings. Now, enchantments is a key word as used in the Bible because it relates to using this drug-related sorcery, and root cuttings are basically using the kind of things like you associate or connotate with classical witchcraft, where you get these roots and cut them out and make potions and spells and things like this. So it suggests that there was an effort made by the dark forces to take the initiative to contact mankind and to introduce them and teach them these techniques. Now, one of the most venerated godlike characters in all of recorded history is Isis. Isis, the goddess of Egypt, which was a goddess whose worship was continued throughout the Greek and Roman era as well. She was probably the most robust religious figure to maintain support even as new kingdoms came along. She was the goddess of magic, and again followed in Egypt and later in Greece and Rome. In the story, the main story involving Isis is that she was actually married to her brother Osiris. And Osiris was confronted by Set, or Seth. Seth is the correct term. And in their battle, Seth was able to destroy him and actually cut him up and send him away. And Isis was able to actually use her magic techniques to gain extra power from Ra and others as a means by which to reassemble Osiris and basically rescue him from the underworld of death. So she was able to get him from underground in the underworld, bring him back, and then, of course, helped birth Horus, which was really according to the mythology of Osiris itself. But it's key to remember that these were brother and sister figures who also had this relationship, and also that she took the initiative to rescue him from the underworld and release him. Now, she has temples at places like Delos, which actually where the temples for Artemis and Apollo are. And if you study the literature, you will find that her image, her attributes are actually associated with Artemis and a few other mythological figures that have, in essence, the same description. Another one, and by the way, Artemis and Apollo that I mentioned, in like manner, are brother and sister figures as well. Hecate is another mythological figure from the ancient days. She was the Greco-Roman goddess of magic and witches. She also, the annalists of these ancient mythologies say, is really related in worship to Isis and to Artemis as well. But she was a clear-cut goddess that was associated with witchcraft, magic, and similar things we'll see here in just a moment. Now, as far as the sorcerers throughout history that use these techniques of theurgy, of invocation, evocation, probably the earliest ones we have are the shamans, which are known as medicine men or witch doctors, whatever you might call them, around the world, usually with indigenous people that go back as far as we have any kind of records, back millennia, where they would actually function on behalf of the local tribe or village. And they had these drugs and other kind of techniques by which they could somehow make communication with higher intelligences, what they called gods, to be able to receive information for medicine, for healings, for things like this for the tribe. And they're well known for that across whether you talk about Eskimos or Central America or other places. Amongst the Western, more modern world, one that really stands out is Dr. John Dee. Dr. John Dee was actually the magician and chief think tank in the court of Queen Elizabeth, in Elizabethan England. He was probably the smartest man in the world. It has been said he had the largest library in the entire world at the time. And he also considered himself a Christian, and that's a very curious matter. But at the same time, he had such a thirst and zeal for knowledge, and he wanted so much to know what about nature, about how the world worked, about other facts, that he took the activity to contact angelic spirits to be able to obtain more knowledge. And he used a technique called scrying, or basically using a crystal ball. And he had another gentleman who actually assisted him, Edward Kelly, I believe is his name, who actually assisted him in making these views in the crystal ball and then making contacts with angels. And the recordings recorded all sorts of information about nature, about science, and there's even indication possibly the New World was communicated through this activity. And while Dr. Dee considered himself a Christian, these beings over time began to say things that were not supportive of a Christian worldview, like you should not pray to Jesus, you should not worship him, and things like this. It terrified his cohort so much that he quit and actually left. He was really a broken man from this contact. But Dr. Dee continued on because of his thirst for knowledge and really compromising his spiritual beliefs. And one major contribution he made was something called Enochian language, Enochian magic. And this was written in something called the Keys of Enoch. And it's something who's actually had its reemergence in the 20th century itself. Now, in fact, one person who was key in doing that was Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley was really the preeminent magician, sorcerer of the 20th century. I think he's without peers, undisputed, as the key in advancing occult knowledge, language, in doing workings itself. It's very curious that his deity encounters that he claimed to have in the presence of other people first was from a homosexual experience that he had, and went right into a particular experience. I'm studying more about his background right now, but there are a number of characters from the spirit world that he claims to have contacted him. One was called Iwas, and dictated to him something called the Book of the Law. Later one was called Lamb, and he's drawn pictures of Lamb. This is back in the teens, 19-teens, and the picture looks remarkably what we associate with alien grays today. But he taught ceremonial magic as well as the ritual use of drugs. And he was a very big proponent of drug taking as a way to bridge the gap to be able to make this contact with the spirit world, both at his Abbey of Thelema, where he liberally gave away drugs, and even his own addictions that he had as well to it. Another gentleman I can mention from the 20th century that played a critical role was someone by the name of Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons is one of the most little-known people in American history, but one of the most disturbing persons in background. He was really the father of the American space program. He is undisputed. In fact, if you ask Werner von Braun or others, they will point to Jack Parsons as the key person to result in our space program. He not only made our first rockets that were used in World War II, but he founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He founded the Caltech rocket program. The rocket company Aerojet, for example, was founded by him. But he was a full-blown occultist. He called himself the Antichrist. And when they would perform rocket tests, either for academia or for the federal government, he would invoke ceremonies of the god Pan whenever he would do his experiments and tests. And he took on the mantle and ran the occult group, the main occult group in America out of Southern California, and was in direct correspondence with Aleister Crowley, and really was seen as his protege. And he developed a group of scientists, literary people, and others that would do these dark occult practices in his home, scare neighbors and other people. Even famous actors like John Carradine participated in these activities. But it became an issue with the FBI as they were watching these things. The thing he's most famous for is something called the Babylon working. And what these sorcerers do when they do a major effort to evoke an evocation of a spirit, they call it a working. And in the Babylon working, he wanted to produce the great whore Babylon that would be, materialize and make itself manifest in this world, and so it could be a consort for the Antichrist in this world. And this activity was done in January 1946 with none other than his assistant L. Ron Hubbard, who was later known to found the Scientology religion. But they worked together and did this effort, and according to their reports, they had another assistant, a woman named Marjorie Cameron, and they claim that they actually witnessed a manifestation of the spirit into the world through their activities itself. So this is just a sample of a few of the people who, in the modern era, have fulfilled this role and well known. And I would like to just mention here, for lack of a better place, as a little addendum here, I'm of the sneaking suspicion that the person today who probably best fits the mantle of Aleister Crowley, who passed away, ironically, in 1947, right in the middle of a period of time that was very interesting from a spiritual and biblical standpoint, a time with the Roswell sightings occurring at that time, the founding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the refounding of the Book of Enoch, just before the founding of the nation of Israel. But since his time, I believe that his mantle probably most likely fits on, of all people, the author, comic book impresario, Alan Moore. Alan Moore was the author of a comic book series called Watchmen that is considered classical literature beyond the comic book phase. And sometime, Chris, if you'd like to have me back, I believe there's embedded within that an occult eschatology, or an occult view symbolic of what they see the end times are going to be. He also conducted V for Vendetta, was another series he did as well. And he had a cohort. He had his own predecessor called Steve Moore. And they together actively pursued the use of drugs and other sorcery by which to contact spirit entities according to their own word. So I think this tradition of sorcerers is still continuing today. Okay, now, in the Bible, just to give you some examples of what the Bible might say about it, the Witch of Endor is one case of sorcery activity going on in 1 Samuel 28. Saul had done a number of things at this time in history that were counter to God's will. He was in great jeopardy. In fact, he had really lost God's blessing because of not doing what God had described him to do. At the same time, he had lost his main associate, the priest Samuel, who was really his main advisor from God, and he felt totally helpless. He was in desperate distress and had to seek out someone who could attempt to contact a dead Samuel to get advice about an upcoming battle. He had already chased the sorcerers out of Israel, as he was instructed to do, so they had to go find another one just outside the area at Endor to use. And so when they used her services, she says that the process when this was ongoing, she saw gods coming up from out of the earth. And that was the thing she saw. And in reasons that I can't fully explain what happened, for some reason it appears that she was permitted to bring forth Samuel for a special purpose, and this purpose was to send a message to Saul that he was doomed and that his life would be taken from him in this upcoming battle. But this process occurred, and in fact it seemed as if even she was startled at his appearance and suddenly realized that Saul was in her presence, who had disguised himself. So that was a sort of a classic event of a sorcery event. Then we have a character in the New Testament by the name of Simon the Sorcerer. Simon the Sorcerer, at the time of the book of Acts, had an entire town spellbound by his sorceries. They were pretty much entirely under his will. However, to some extent, he had succumbed to the message of the gospel. And he proceeded and was baptized. But he fully did not understand the full nature of what it meant to become a disciple of Christ, because he tried to buy the Holy Spirit from the apostles. And he thought this, I guess, looking back on his old days as a sorcerer, where you actually had to put money down to gain new information, new gnosis, new magical power. He saw the work of the Holy Spirit and he wanted it for whatever reason. But he was, as you can imagine, he was chastised for this and severely rebuked. And ironically, he was told he was of the wormwood of hatred for this. And I want you to remember that word, wormwood and hatred, because they are associated together. They do have a later connection to sorcery, I believe. Now, another very harrowing event also in the book of Acts was regarding worshippers in Ephesus of the goddess Diana, which is the same goddess is known in Greek as Artemis, someone who we'll be talking about shortly. The whole town basically was devoted to the worship of Diana. When Paul and others came in preaching the gospel, many turned instead to Christ and caused a major revolt, particularly by the idol makers, which were the people who were making money off of the support of worship of her. And they brought the people there into a citywide chaos of wrath. The word wrath is used there, thymos, which is described from that passage as a passion, angry heat, glow, ardor, wine of passion, which either drives the drinker mad or kills him with its strength. So that's the definition from Strong's Concordance of the word used there. We're not talking about just a general run-of-the-mill anger, something that was a rage that would either drive someone mad or kill the person because of this. So I think there was something spiritual going on. And those in your audience who are familiar with Pastor Russ Dizdar and his discussion about an upcoming Black Awakening where massive numbers of people are going to have possibly submerged demonic personalities called forth, have been placed for a future day or hour. Their kind of activity of chaos sounds similar to what happens in this passage. And in this discussion of Diana, they mentioned that an image of her that was in their temple there locally had fallen from heaven. So they had this idea of her being in the heavens and falling down into the temple itself. And I just want to tell your listeners to keep these elements in mind because they're going to be cited again. Later in Revelation 18, there's a very, very important passage that many people gloss over, Bible teachers and others. In that passage, if you read it, you will find very clearly that the kings of the earth and the great merchants of the earth conspire together, and it says they do sorcery, and the word used there is pharmakia, which is the use of drugs to control the activities of the world, and it says through this they deceive the nations of the earth, which is a very, very powerful passage and describes a lot of what is talked about on internet radio shows today about the deception of our world systems and institutions over the populace, over their control of food and drugs and things like this. Well, that's right out of the pages of the Bible, I believe, and I think this passage makes it clear that there is a consortium of government officials as well as people that are in the business, the commercial business, and they find it to their mutual advantage of control to make use of sorcery, which involves the use of drugs and also through dark spiritual powers, and the net effect is they're able to deceive large portions of the world public in their process of this communication. Now, just going into some details of some of these chemicals that we're talking about, some of the more common ones, and these chemicals would probably be best described by the term entheogens, which are drugs which do something to your psychosis, your spirit, to enable you to overcome any barriers to make direct contact with spirits in the spirit world. And some of the natural substances include something like, I believe it's pronounced psilocybin. It's basically known as magic mushrooms. It's the ingredient in the hallucinogenic mushrooms. We have another chemical called scopolamine, which is also enclosed in chemicals like or plants, natural growing plants like belladonna, henbane, witch's herb, and even something called angel's trumpets, which is very ironic given a later reference we're going to make here. DMT, and its use in a blended form in ayahuasca tea made by the shamans in the Amazon area. And then we have mescaline, which comes from peyote and similar sources like this in Central America. Now, there are man-made chemicals. We have not been satisfied with the natural entheogens. Man has decided to make his own more concentrated versions, and some of these are things like LSD, chemical DMX, which I'll mention more just in a moment, and even commonplace alcohol in certain cases does a very effective role as an entheogen. Now, just to comment on two of these, dextromethorphan, or DMX, believe it or not, it's just used as the key ingredient in common cough suppressants. If you go to the drugstore and look for your cough suppressants, they're going to have a DMX, DM symbol typically on them. Unfortunately, according to news reports that are out, it is widely misused as a psychotropic drug by at least 3.1 million Americans. And that's just young Americans that are using this very common over-the-counter drug, taking it in portions that will actually create some kind of spiritual contact. And the reports I have said that they've documented entity contacts, out-of-body experiences, and other paranormal events by use of this simple chemical that we have in our own drug cabinets. Now, scopolamine was used actually in early forms of Percodan, and now it's being used for various depression drugs right now. So it's a common use for this. It was used by shamans in their burundanga plants, plant where they used it for their contact with the spirit. It is now considered, its usage is a virtual epidemic in Colombia, in similar places right now, and it's actually been used as a robbery device where people will be slipped this drug and actually be robbed or have other things done to them without their memory, where they lose their memory of it. And it's been described that when people use it recreationally, it will create what they call realistic psychic events. So not just a simple hallucination of my head deceived me on what I saw, but something much more realistic. And this particular chemical has traditionally been used by witches and sorcerers to see their gods. So these kind of key roots and plants, like we referred to, that the early angels taught mankind, has been used since then, this information preserved for them to make their spirit contacts as well. Now, what I'd like to focus on a little bit is one called dimethyltryptamine, or better known DMT. DMT is present and naturally occurring in plants in the Amazon basin area. It's very popular with shamans in that area, and they make it in something called ayahuasca tea, and this maximizes the effectiveness in it. Now, this particular chemical is made in various parts of the body. Some have theorized that it's actually produced in the human pineal gland, which we'll speak about in just a moment, but in any case, it's made within the body. Unfortunately, or fortunately, however you see it, there are other enzymes that are actually in your gastrointestinal tract that will actually quickly dissipate its presence in the body. And these are called, I believe, monoamine oxidase enzymes, or MAO. And what happens is you need to take something called an MAOI, or MAO inhibitor, chemical that will actually stop these enzymes from breaking it down. And that's, in fact, what is put in ayahuasca tea. The other ingredients that are added do this MAOI function of inhibiting the breakdown of it and allow it to go through your body and your brain for even a multi-hour mystical experience. And DMT is one particular chemical that has earned a reputation for very reliable contact of the spirit world. Virtual 100% incidence of a deep spirit contact with taking the chemical, and usually within seconds for many cases such as intravenous use. Just to give you one example of what a DMT experience would be like, there was a National Geographic magazine columnist that went to the Amazon to, quote, experience DMT and take it along with the shamans in this ayahuasca tea. And she had stated in the article that she basically was an atheist, so she had a lot of skepticism about these spiritual aspects. But what happened was, when she actually took it in their little circle where they pass it around and take it, she said she experienced, and this is just a summary, she was falling down this deep chasm or abyss, and surrounded by souls that were crying out to her, that were reaching out with their arms and crying out and asking, pleading for help, that she would get them out of where they were stuck or kept. And she landed in the bottom of this pit and saw 3 thrones that were enthroned with figures on them, and she was absolutely terrified for her life. She could sense the evil and hate, and they said that you are doomed here, you'll never leave, there is no hope, there's no way out of here. And one of the curious things about this particular drug, unlike just a garden variety hallucinogen, is that communal experiences seem to be possible with this drug, where people experience a common reality. And according to her narrative there, a couple other people who were more experienced that had taken the drug actually intervened in her incidents and brought her out of this particular event. And it's very interesting that having a reputable group like National Geographic actually published this, and someone who really was not promoting the drug per se, but she makes some pretty far-out claims that, for example, that as soon as that incident was over, she began throwing up and threw up something that appeared to be a black snake in the bowl where she was throwing up and things like this. So these are experiences that are really unparalleled, even amongst other hallucinogenic drugs. But one of the key studies with DMT that really caused a lot of attention, and this is one that really got my attention in this whole subject area, was a study that was done by Dr. Rick Strassman, a psychiatrist, a clinical psychiatrist, back in 1991 at the University of New Mexico, funded by the federal government. They were formal clinical trials in hospital, well-funded, under tightly controlled conditions, and they were documented in a book called DMT, the Spirit Drug, which is a book that's still available. And I reviewed that book, and they screened them out. A number of the subjects, for example, had no knowledge of UFOs, any kind of information like this. A few of them were prior drug users, so they could determine if this was like a common trip that they'd had before or something unique. The rest of them were not drug users. So they looked at these various facets. But what they found consistently was within seconds of intake, these subjects interacted, these test subjects, with creatures that resembled alien greys or reptilian creatures or even insectoid creatures, and reliably interacted with these kind of creatures. And in fact, these insectoids sounded like praying mantis or locusts, actually. While the test subjects were there, they were even being interviewed while they were having this experience. So Dr. Strassman was talking to them, taking notes while they were encountering these entities. And they were aware that they were in two worlds.